don't leave the store,
I don't leave the store.
you're going to go to jail.
You don't understand.
You are going to go to
Go
jail. Do
ahead.
you understand
Go
that?
ahead. Yes. Go ahead. Check my bag.
Yeah, I'm not going to check your bag. I'm going to take you to jail.
No.
The encounter begins the way so many low-stakes police calls do. A retail store, a completed purchase, a misunderstanding that should have resolved itself within minutes. Nothing about the opening moments suggests danger, violence, or criminal intent. What it does reveal almost immediately is a fragile balance of authority, perception, and control that will soon collapse under the weight of small decisions made without restraint. By the time officers arrive, the transaction has already concluded. The receipt exists. The item is accounted for. There is no allegation of theft, no description of a crime in progress, no report of violence. The store manager explains that the customer was watched while exiting standard loss prevention behavior, but that the interaction escalated when the customer perceived that attention as accusatory. Eye contact became a point of friction. Silence became suspicion. From there, the situation did not escalate because of an unlawful act, but because of discomfort. This distinction matters. Law enforcement authority does not originate from discomfort or annoyance. It originates from articulable facts that establish reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Yet from the outset, the officers framed the interaction not as a neutral assessment of facts, but as a problem of compliance. The moment the manager requests a trespass warning, the entire encounter pivots. The question is no longer what happened, but whether the individual will submit. Trespass law is deceptively simple and often misunderstood. A private business can ask someone to leave for almost any non-discriminatory reason. Once that request is clearly communicated, refusal can form the basis for trespass after warning. But clarity is essential. So is timing. The warning must be unambiguous. The opportunity to comply must be real. And critically, enforcement must be proportional. Here, clarity is never achieved. The individual repeatedly expresses confusion not about the request to leave, but about the justification. She insists on proof. She references the receipt. She returns again and again to the same point. She paid, she did not steal, she was followed, she feels targeted. These statements are not admissions of guilt. They are expressions of distress and disbelief. Rather than de-escalate that confusion, the officers amplify it. Commands are issued rapidly, often overlapping. The language becomes absolute. You cannot come back here. If you don't leave, you're going to jail. The shift is subtle but consequential. The officers move from explaining a boundary to threatening incarceration as a tool of persuasion. This is where authority begins to harden. Not because the law requires it, but because the interaction has become about control. The customer is no longer treated as a person navigating an unfamiliar system. She is treated as an obstacle to be removed. The opening hook moment where jail is invoked repeatedly within seconds is not just dramatic, it is diagnostic. It reveals how quickly discretionary power can be weaponized when patience erodes. The officers are no longer weighing options. They are issuing ultimatums. And ultimatums, by their nature, leave no room for understanding, only submission or punishment. What follows is a pattern common in body camera footage across jurisdictions. A loop of misunderstanding reinforced by authority. The individual asks for proof. The officers restate commands. The individual resists verbally. The officers escalate consequences. Each pass through the loop increases tension while reducing the possibility of peaceful resolution. It is important to note what is not happening. There is no attempt to slow the interaction. No officer takes the time to separate parties, to speak calmly, to restate the trespass warning in plain terms, and allow space for compliance. Instead, the pressure intensifies. The insistence on immediate compliance becomes the central objective. Language barriers and stress compound the problem. The individual's speech patterns suggest difficulty processing rapid commands, yet the pace accelerates rather than slows. Confusion is interpreted as defiance. Questions are interpreted as refusal. Emotional distress is interpreted as disorderly conduct. Each interpretation nudges the encounter closer to arrest. At this stage, the legal justification remains thin. Trespass after warning requires a clear refusal to leave after being informed. But the record shows repeated attempts to negotiate understanding, not a clear declaration of intent to remain indefinitely. The individual stands near the front door. She gestures to cameras. She references the receipt. These behaviors suggest a desire to be heard, not a plan to occupy the store unlawfully. Still, the officers continue down the enforcement path. The language becomes increasingly personal. You're making a big scene. Get out of my face. These statements are revealing. They are not legal assessments. They are emotional reactions. And when emotional reactions drive enforcement decisions, discretion turns into liability. The moment of arrest does not arrive because new facts emerge. It arrives because patience runs out. The officers frame the arrest as inevitably you're going to jail anyway, which is a critical psychological shift. Once inevitability is declared, de-escalation becomes impossible. Every subsequent action is justified retroactively by the decision already made. From there, the encounter transitions from verbal conflict to physical control. The individual clutches personal items, particularly the receipt. This is symbolic as much as practical. The receipt represents proof, legitimacy, and fairness in her mind. Letting it go feels like conceding that none of those things matter. The officers view the receipt differently. To them, anything in a detainee's hand becomes a potential safety issue, a procedural obstacle. The clash is not over paper, it is over meaning. And meaning, when ignored, turns resistance into force. What is striking is how many opportunities for resolution pass unused. At multiple points, officers acknowledge that no theft occurred. They acknowledge that the receipt exists. They acknowledge that the item will be returned. Yet the physical struggle continues, prolonged not by necessity, but by insistence on total compliance. This is how minor incidents become traumatic, not through malice alone, but through rigidity, through an inability or unwillingness to adapt enforcement to the human reality unfolding in front of the camera. By the end of this first phase, the original reason for the call is almost unrecognizable. A woman bought juice. A manager felt uncomfortable. Police arrived to restore order. Somewhere along the way, authority became the goal rather than the tool. The bodycam does not show a dangerous criminal. It shows a system struggling to tolerate confusion. And when confusion is treated as defiance, the outcome is almost predetermined. This case is not about whether a business can trespass a customer. It can. It is about how law enforcement chooses to exercise its discretion in moments where the law allows multiple paths forward. One path prioritizes explanation, patience, and dignity. The other prioritizes speed, dominance, and compliance. What unfolds here is the second path. And once taken, it pulls everyone along with it: officers, the individual, and the institution they represent. By the time the cuffs come out, the legal question is no longer whether the arrest is technically permissible. The question is whether it was necessary at all. And that question lingers, unresolved, as the scene moves from the store floor to the back of a patrol car. Once the decision to arrest is made, everything that follows exists in its shadow. From this point forward, the encounter is no longer shaped by facts or proportionality, but by process. Procedure replaces judgment. Compliance becomes the only acceptable outcome, and every behavior is interpreted through that lens. The transition from verbal enforcement to physical custody is abrupt, but not chaotic. It is methodical, almost routine. That is precisely what makes it unsettling. There is no emergency unfolding, no sudden threat that forces action. Instead, the arrest proceeds because the system has reached a point where backing down would feel like losing authority. The individual is told repeatedly that she is going to jail anyway. This phrasing matters. It removes contingency. It communicates that cooperation will not change the outcome, only the level of force required to reach it. Once that message is delivered, resistance becomes rational. If the destination is fixed, then preserving dignity or proof or autonomy becomes the only remaining leverage. This dynamic plays out clearly in the struggle over the receipt. On paper, the issue is simple. Detainees cannot hold objects during transport or processing. In practice, the receipt has taken on symbolic weight far beyond its physical form. It is the last tangible link to the original truth of the encounter that a purchase was made, that no theft occurred, that the conflict began over perception rather than action. For the officers, the receipt is an object to be secured. For the individual, it is validation. Neither side articulates this difference, but it governs every movement that follows. As officers attempt to remove items from her hands, the language used reveals competing priorities. On one hand, they express a desire not to hurt her, acknowledging the disproportion between force and object. On the other hand, they persist, applying incremental pressure despite recognizing the absurdity of the struggle. It's just a receipt is said more than once, not as a reason to stop, but as a justification for continuing. This is one of the most revealing moments of the encounter. The officers understand, intellectually, that the situation has become excessive. Yet they are unable to disengage. The logic of enforcement demands completion. The procedure must be followed, even if it no longer serves a meaningful purpose. What could have been resolved through time waiting, calming, explaining is instead resolved through force. Fingers are pried open. Pain compliance is implied. The individual pleads, protests, and resists not violently, but stubbornly. Her resistance is not about escape. It is about control over something that still feels hers. Throughout this phase, the tone of the officers oscillates between reassurance and impatience. They explain the process, promise the receipt will be returned, emphasize safety protocols. At the same time, frustration leaks through. The repetition of commands accelerates. The patience displayed earlier evaporates. This oscillation is a hallmark of procedural escalation. Officers are trained to narrate actions for the camera, to verbalize intentions, to frame force as reluctant and necessary. But narration does not equal de-escalation. When the underlying decision is fixed, words become background noise. The physical struggle is prolonged not because of resistance alone, but because neither side can relinquish their position without feeling diminished. The officers cannot abandon procedure. The individual cannot relinquish proof. The result is a stalemate resolved only by superior force. Importantly, there is no allegation that the individual poses a danger to the officers. No weapons are suspected. No threats are credible. The safety justification exists in theory, not in fact. Yet the tactics employed, pain compliance, physical manipulation, are the same tools used in far more serious encounters. This is how normalization occurs. When force used in trivial cases mirrors force used in dangerous ones, the distinction between necessity and habit erodes. What should feel excessive begins to feel routine. As the individual is moved to the patrol vehicle, the atmosphere shifts again. The volume lowers. The commands become calmer. The officers speak more gently. This tonal shift is striking. It underscores that the earlier escalation was not inevitable. Calm was always available, it simply was not chosen when it mattered most. In the back of the vehicle, a new narrative emerges. Officers check on her well-being. They ask basic orientation questions. They frame themselves as helpers. This is not inherently disingenuous, but it is jarring. The same system that moments earlier insisted on force now seeks cooperation and trust. From the individual's perspective, this shift is destabilizing. The authority that caused pain now asks for consent. The people who dismissed her confusion now inquire about her condition. Trust, once broken, does not regenerate on command. The continued fixation on the receipt persists even here. Officers reiterate that it will be documented, secured, returned. The insistence suggests awareness of its importance, yet that awareness arrived too late to alter the course of events. The damage, physical, emotional, psychological, has already been done. This phase of the encounter highlights a deeper institutional issue: the compartmentalization of responsibility. Each officer performs their role correctly within the narrow confines of procedure. The arresting officer enforces trespass. The assisting officers handle transport. The processing officers manage property. At no point does anyone step back to reassess the totality. Systems are designed this way for efficiency and accountability. But in cases like this, compartmentalization becomes a shield. No single actor feels responsible for the outcome because each followed protocol. Yet the outcome itself, an arrest born of misunderstanding and rigidity, remains. The individual's repeated insistence on proof is never meaningfully addressed. The camera footage exists. The receipt exists. The store cameras exist. But none of these matter in the moment because the legal threshold has shifted. Once trespass after warning is invoked, the original facts become irrelevant. This is a critical point. Law enforcement interactions often hinge not on truth, but on compliance with authority. Whether the underlying grievance is valid does not alter the enforcement mechanism once certain lines are crossed. This reality is rarely communicated clearly to civilians, especially those unfamiliar with the system. The officer's frustration is understandable on a human level. Repetition is exhausting. Resistance is taxing. But understanding frustration does not justify escalation. Authority carries an obligation to absorb frustration without transferring it into force. As the scene winds down, the bodycam captures a quieter moment. The struggle is over. The receipt is secured. The individual is restrained. Safety protocols are satisfied. On paper, the call is resolved. But resolution is not the same as justice, and closure is not the same as legitimacy. What remains is a record of how a system responds when challenged not by violence but by confusion. When an individual refuses to accept authority without explanation, the system does not slow down to meet her. It speeds up to outrun her questions. This is not an anomaly. It is a pattern visible in countless bodycam recordings. Minor incidents escalate not because of criminal intent, but because authority is treated as fragile, something that must be defended at all costs. The tragedy of this encounter is not that someone was arrested for trespass. It is that no one involved seemed empowered to choose a different ending once the momentum began. Every step forward felt mandatory, even when it clearly was not. By the time the vehicle door closes, the original issuer purchased item, a perceived slight, a request to leave, has been buried beneath layers of procedure. What remains is a person in custody, bewildered and hurt, and a system that considers the matter closed. But the camera keeps recording, and what it captures is not just an arrest, but a lesson, one about how easily authority can become inflexible and how quickly discretion can disappear when compliance becomes the only metric of success. The final phase of this encounter will not introduce new facts. It will instead force a reckoning with what has already occurred and whether the system is capable of recognizing its own excesses once the adrenaline fades. By the final stage of the encounter, the physical struggle has ended, but the consequences are still unfolding. The scene is quieter now. The commands have softened. The urgency that once dominated every exchange has dissipated, replaced by routine checks and procedural language. This tonal shift is not incidental. It reveals something fundamental about how authority operates once resistance has been neutralized. The individual is now secured, restrained, and contained. In this state, she is no longer perceived as a problem to be solved, but as a responsibility to be managed. The same system that moments earlier escalated with threats and force now reorients itself toward caretaking. Officers ask about her condition. They verify her name. They check her orientation to time and place. These actions are framed as concern, and in isolation, they are appropriate. But context matters. Compassion after coercion does not erase coercion. It sits beside it, creating a contradiction that the system rarely acknowledges. Throughout this phase, officers speak calmly, almost gently. They explain what will happen next. They reassure her that her property will be documented, preserved, and returned. The receipt so fiercely contested earlier has now been reduced to an administrative item, placed in a property bag, logged, and forgotten. The irony is stark. The object that justified force minutes ago now poses no issue at all. This contrast exposes a central flaw in the encounter: the refusal to distinguish between symbolic resistance and actual threat. The individual never attempted to flee. She never attempted to harm anyone. Her resistance was localized, focused on retaining possession of something she believed mattered. Yet the response escalated as though control itself were at risk. Once she is seated in the vehicle, the conversation shifts again. Officers introduce themselves by name. They position themselves as helpers. They ask if she feels sick or tired. This rebranding of authority from enforcer to caretaker highlights how situational police power truly is. The same badge can command, coerce, or console, depending on the phase of interaction. For the individual, this shift is disorienting. The emotional continuity of the encounter has been broken. She is expected to respond calmly now, despite having just experienced physical force and emotional distress. The system demands immediate emotional compliance, even as it offers delayed empathy. The questions about orientation and well-being suggest that officers may now be considering mental health factors. This, too, arrives late. Signs of confusion, fixation, and distress were present from the beginning. They were visible in her repeated demands for proof, her looping explanations, her inability to move past the receipt. These were not new developments. They were simply refrained once physical control was achieved. This sequence reflects a broader institutional tendency. Mental health considerations are often invoked after force, not before. De-escalation becomes a postscript rather than a strategy. The opportunity to slow down, to interpret behavior through a lens of vulnerability rather than defiance, is missed. The officer's dialogue suggests no malicious intent. They do not mock her. They do not threaten her further. In fact, they appear relieved that the struggle is over. This relief, however, underscores how the system prioritizes resolution over reflection. Once the immediate challenge is resolved, there is little incentive to examine whether the path taken was justified. What is absent in this final phase is any acknowledgement of escalation. There is no moment where an officer says, even privately, that the situation went too far. There is no recognition that the arrest stemmed from a misunderstanding that compounded into force. The narrative remains intact. Commands were given, compliance was refused, enforcement followed. This narrative is powerful because it absolves individuals of responsibility while reinforcing institutional norms. If every step was justified by the previous one, then no step can be questioned. The system closes ranks around its own logic. Yet the bodycam tells a more complicated story. It shows how quickly discretion narrowed, how options disappeared not because of law, but because of impatience. It shows how authority, once challenged, became brittle. And it shows how force was used not to stop harm, but to end disagreement. The final transport procedures unfold without incident. The individual complies. She follows instructions. She opens her hand when asked. The receipt is handled without struggle. This compliance demonstrates something crucial. She was always capable of cooperation. What she resisted was not authority itself, but authority exercised without explanation or acknowledgement. This distinction is often lost in enforcement culture. Resistance is treated as a binary present or absent rather than as a spectrum influenced by understanding, fear, and trust. When officers interpret all resistance as defiance, they respond with tools designed to overpower, not to persuade. The lasting impact of this encounter extends beyond the individual. It reinforces a message to anyone watching. Compliance is mandatory. Understanding is optional. The law may allow questions, but the system does not reward them. Once authority is asserted, the safest path is silence and submission, regardless of fairness. This message erodes public trust not because people reject law enforcement, but because they recognize the imbalance. They see that minor misunderstandings can lead to arrest. They see that proof and reason may not matter in the moment, and they see that dignity is often the first casualty of expedience. From an institutional perspective, this case will likely be logged as routine, a trespass call, a non-compliant subject, an arrest without injury. The metrics will show success, no officer harmed, no property damaged beyond minor scuffling, procedure followed. The deeper questions will remain unasked. Those questions are uncomfortable. Could this have ended without an arrest? Almost certainly. Could patience have replaced force? Repeatedly. Could explanation have diffused resistance? The evidence suggests yes. But asking those questions requires a culture that values discretion as much as control. It requires acknowledging that authority is not weakened by restraint, but strengthened by it. The bodycam does not lie, but it does not interpret itself. What it shows here is not a failure of law, but a failure of imagination. The inability to envision an outcome where authority does not need to assert itself fully to be effective. In the end, the individual will move through the system. Charges may be filed or dropped. Paperwork will be completed. The officers will move on to the next call. Life will continue. What remains is the footage and the lesson it offers to those willing to look closely. Power does not announce its misuse with dramatic gestures. It reveals itself in small choices. The decision to threaten jail instead of explaining, the decision to escalate instead of pause, the decision to prioritize compliance over clarity. Each choice, individually defensible, collectively transforms a trivial incident into a profound one. This encounter is not about villains or heroes. It is about a system that struggles to tolerate ambiguity. When faced with confusion, it defaults to force. When faced with resistance, it accelerates. And when faced with the consequences, it quiets down and moves on. The camera keeps recording, but the system stops listening. And that is where accountability begins, not with outrage, but with recognition. Recognition that authority, when unchecked by patience and empathy, can turn everyday misunderstandings into moments that linger long after the lights and sirens fade. This is not an isolated story. It is a familiar one. And until the lessons it offers are taken seriously, it will continue to repeat quietly, routinely, and on camera.